Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jim McGovern, and I want to welcome you to this hearing today. I apologize for being a little bit late, but we just finished votes, and I'm a little bit out of breath and out of shape too, I think. But I want to welcome everybody. I want to thank you for attending this important hearing on the threats faced by civil society and human rights defenders. I want to thank the many activists, non-governmental organizations, congregations, and journalists who work through peaceful means to make their countries better. You are unsung heroes, and I deeply appreciate everything you do to promote and protect universally recognized human rights, to document and expose human rights violations, and to hold governments accountable. And I greatly admire your courage and your leadership. In particular, I want to thank Rupal Mehta and Kate Hickson and the staff, Jordan Tammer, and the whole staff of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for organizing this hearing. And I want to thank our witnesses for their leadership in working to support civil society and human rights. Civil society is essential to democracy and can help improve lives and empower citizens in countless ways. Civil society and human rights defenders play a key role in fostering democracy, mobilizing people around human rights issues, and ensuring that governments live up to their commitments. When governments crack down on the rights of citizens to engage in basic civic activities, it is not only human rights that are undermined. Civil society restrictions also tend to limit political and economic progress more broadly. Unfortunately, in many countries, civil society organizations face increasing restrictions, while human rights defenders themselves are threatened, censored, detained, tortured, and even killed. As more governments draft restrictive laws, civil society organizations are finding it more difficult to carry out their important work. Governments need to see civic activists as partners and not as opponents. Governments need to understand that collaboration with civil society is not a sign of weakness, but that it is essential to a strong democracy. When NGOs come under threat, governments should provide protection where they can. Human rights defenders, in particular, face serious difficulties in many places, from China to Russia, from Bahrain to Mexico, from Egypt to Zimbabwe, and in dozens of other countries, governments are preventing human rights defenders from carrying out their critical work as protectors of fundamental freedoms. In addition to examining the issue from a global perspective during this hearing, we've chosen to look more in depth at a couple of countries where conditions are very challenging for civil society and human rights defenders. In Ethiopia and Colombia, activists work under extreme pressure, often experiencing human rights abuses themselves. In 2009, Ethiopia passed the Charities and Societies Proclamation Law, which has changed the face of civil society in Ethiopia. It violates Ethiopia's constitution and international human rights obligations. It is so restrictive that not even well-respected NGOs have been able to successfully register, forcing organizations to cut programs, close offices, and lay off staff. The International Center for Not-for-Profit Law notes that Colombia is one of the most dangerous places in the world to be a human rights defender, with dozens of defenders murdered each year. There were 239 reported attacks on human rights defenders in Colombia in 2011. In addition, human rights defenders in the country face criminal prosecutions, violations of the home, and interference with communications. This hearing is an opportunity to examine the precarious situation facing civil society activists and human rights defenders in Ethiopia, Colombia, and other countries, and to consider ways to support these unsung heroes more strongly. I would like to welcome our first panel of administration witnesses. I am grateful to these witnesses and their colleagues at the State Department and the U.S. Agency for International Development for their leadership in support of civil society and human rights defenders. The Commission looks forward to hearing about the administration's recently launched strategic dialogue with civil society, which elevates the importance of the government's work with civil society and reinforces the U.S. commitment to protect and defend civil society worldwide. We also look forward to hearing from the State Department and USAID about their important efforts to support human rights defenders and civil society groups on the ground. Our first witnesses will be, and not necessarily in the order they're going to speak, but in the order they're listed here, Donald Steinberg, Deputy Administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development. We also have with us Michael Posner, Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the State Department. And we have Tomika Tillman, a Senior Advisor to Secretary of State for Civil Society and Emerging Democracies. Dr. Tillman, it is wonderful to see you carrying out the terrific work of your grandfather, Tom Lantos, who this commission is named after, a man who I admired greatly. I still admire his legacy and all that he's done in support of democracy and human rights. And we are also thrilled to have your grandmother, Annette Lantos, here, who is also, in her own right, a great champion of human rights, who I remember for as far back as there was a human rights caucus before a commission, that she attended virtually every one of them, and was very much a driving force behind making sure that human rights stayed front and center in this Congress. So it's great to have the witnesses and this wonderful audience. We have a very full hearing today with 6 witnesses providing testimony, and given that, I ask each of you to keep your oral testimony to 5 minutes or so. Your written testimony will be submitted in the record, and Mr. Posner, we will begin with you.
Great. Thank you, Chairman McGovern, and also for your lifelong commitment to these issues. This is an important hearing on an important set of issues that are becoming more and more important. 35 years ago, when the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor was created, there were very few human rights NGOs and civil society groups outside of the United States and Western Europe. I remember in the early 80s when we began it, I couldn't find a human rights group there. In fact, there were virtually none in sub-Saharan Africa. There has been a dramatic change over these last 35 years, and thousands of brave people in countries all over the world, including some that you mentioned, are today on the front lines risking their lives. In this country, we talk about political activists, journalists, bloggers, human rights activists, public interest lawyers, netizens, and so on. These distinctions don't really mean much in most of the world, where the more meaningful divide is between citizens who dare to come together to engage in public dialogue and those who remain silent. And around the world, the ranks of those who are engaged is growing, and they are playing a critical role. The common thread is that they pursue their goals peacefully. They focus on education, opening minds, fostering understanding, building bridges. Secretary Clinton described them as, in a speech in Krakow in 2010, as a collection of activists, organizations, congregation, writers, reporters that work peacefully to encourage governments to do better by their own people. These are important groups, and it's important that we support them. But it's not surprising that many governments find their activities threatening. Some react by blaming outside forces for violating their sovereignty, stirring up dissent. To us, these groups gather information, amplify voices that have too long been silent. But to some governments, they pose a threat to civility. And this hearing, I think, looks at that, the challenges we face. This is a challenging time in countries of the Arab awakening and around the world, from Astana to Colombo, from Addis Ababa to Russia to Egypt to China. Governments have taken steps to quash freedom of expression, assembly, and association. Since last December, Egypt has undertaken legal action against several U.S., Egyptian, and other NGOs, and in countries as diverse as Russia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Algeria, Malaysia, Kyrgyzstan, Venezuela, and Vietnam, there are either new laws that have been introduced or additional restrictions are now being proposed. This pushback from governments comes in several forms. Some are making it tougher to form NGOs. Others are trying to actively constrain foreign funding. Other governments are taking measures to restrict freedom of assembly or freedom of expression. All of these restrictions are neither new nor unexpected, but there are clearly a range of states that are employing these measures in greater numbers than we've seen before. I think our message today is that we need to hold our nerve, and we need to sustain our engagement with these citizens who continue to advocate peacefully for change from within their own societies. I just want to end with a couple of words of what we're trying to do in the Obama administration. We don't support political parties or candidates. What we do is to support the right of individuals to exercise their fundamental freedoms of expression, association, and assembly, and to bring peaceful change in their own personal systems. We do this, and in the Bureau of Human Rights, the extend for programming. We start by listening. We listen to civil society groups. We engage with them. We just had a meeting in Tunis under UNESCO's program for World Press Freedom Day, where we brought journalists from a range of Middle East countries together to tell us what they're experiencing. The engagement also involves our discussions with foreign governments, with China, with Vietnam, with Uzbekistan, with Russia. We constantly reaffirm the U.S. government's support for a freely functioning civil society. Third, we raise these issues in multilateral fora. We play a leading role at the UN in creating last year a special rapporteur on freedom of association, which is a new position that will look at these issues. We do it with public diplomacy like this hearing, and again, I commend you for holding this hearing. And finally, we do it through our programs. We now have 4 or 5 initiatives, including the Lifeline Fund, which is called the Embattled NGO Assistance Fund. We've managed to recruit 14 other donor governments to help us build a pool of about $5 million to help NGOs when they get in trouble. Another set of funds deal with NGOs working on LGBT issues, yet another working on religious freedom issues. We've been successful in some places, and I'm glad to talk about these in the questions and answers. I would cite in particular Cambodia, where 2 years ago we helped local NGOs challenge a restrictive NGO law that we've managed to hold now at bay for 2 years. But our successes and failures are neither permanent nor guaranteed. It's important for us to stay the course and remain vigilant and tenacious. And we benefit by your involvement, the involvement of Congress, in reinforcing our best instincts. So again, I want to thank you for holding this hearing, and I'm glad to answer you.
Thank you very much. And just want the audience to know we've been joined by Congresswoman Bonamici of Oregon, and we're happy to have her here. Mr. Tillman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by thanking you and the Commission for the opportunity to testify today. If you will forgive a moment of personal privilege, my late grandfather did not know that this body would be created before he passed away, but I'm confident that few things would have pleased him more than seeing the Commission carry on his commitment to the cause of human rights. And in the context of today's topic, I should note that he always had a deep appreciation for the indispensable role of civil society in defending human rights, and he would have applauded the focus of this hearing. So I want to thank you as a member of the family for the work that you're continuing to do. We are coming together this afternoon at a moment of profound change. The world is witnessing a fundamental renegotiation of power relationships that have historically defined interactions between citizens and governments. Advances in technology and shifts in culture are providing individuals with access to new sources of information and new tools for activism. And as a result, citizens' expectations for governments and governance are shifting. Civil society has been at the forefront of this phenomenon. Social networking sites, microblogs, and mobile phones are making it easier and cheaper than ever before for individuals to hold governments accountable and advance the common good. And as this occurs, civil society groups are emerging as a powerful catalyst for global change. Now, it should not come as a surprise that many governments confronting these dynamics are pushing back aggressively against civil society organizations and their demands for increased accountability. Over the last several years, as we've heard, more than 50 governments have either introduced or considered legislation that imposed constraints on the work of civil society organizations or limited their ability to receive funding. These and other regulatory threats constitute a clear and present danger to the work of civil society, and Assistant Secretary Posner discussed how we are acting through a variety of mechanisms to address these challenges. At the same time, at the State Department, we are working to reaffirm the centrality of civil society in our own diplomacy. Last February, Secretary Clinton launched a new strategic dialogue with civil society. This initiative, modeled on our dialogues with key bilateral partners, is designed to elevate our engagement with civil society alongside our work with governments. Over the past year, senior department officials, including Assistant Secretary Posner, have come together with civil society representatives under the auspices of the dialogue to address issues including democracy and human rights, religion and foreign policy, governance and accountability, empowering women, and labor issues.
Civil society working groups on these issues have developed concrete policy recommendations. And yesterday, at the launch of the Strategic Dialogue's 2012 summit, Secretary Clinton announced action on the first 8 of these recommendations before a worldwide audience of civil society representatives. More details on these recommendations are available on the State Department's website, but I'll mention just a few highlights. We will be providing more extensive systematic training for State Department personnel on how to engage religious communities and protect religious freedom. This training will be offered both at the Foreign Service Institute and online, and it will facilitate our diplomatic outreach to faith communities around the world. We will be expanding our efforts to encourage countries undergoing political transitions to enshrine equal citizenship for all in their new constitutions. As part of this work, we will be launching new Arabic language information efforts to support full and equal rights for women. We will be coming together with other partners to institutionalize a platform for dialogue with representatives from labor and business groups at G20 summits. We will be developing new opportunities for South-South cooperation on labor issues, and beginning with 10 posts around the world, we will be establishing mission-based civil society working groups within the dialogue to address issues of local and regional importance. Our strategic dialogue with civil society already involves more than 50 bureaus and offices at the State Department and USAID. It is providing us with a platform for translating the insights of civil society into our foreign policy, and we are looking forward to expanding this important initiative. We are also increasing our engagement with the community of democracies and other international bodies that provide frameworks for multilateral cooperation with civil society. Within the community of democracies, we and other like-minded governments are now working alongside civil society and task forces to strengthen new democracies in Moldova and Tunisia and tackle a range of other challenges. These efforts are providing a model for countries around the world of how government and civil society can come together to deliver results for the citizens we serve. We know this work will not be easy, and we recognize that while there have been pockets of excellence in our government on these issues, in many respects this is uncharted terrain. By comparison, government-to-government diplomacy has been around for a very long time, and we are still developing tools to collaborate with civil society. But as we survey the vital contributions civil society has made to expanding human rights and opportunity in our own country, it's easy to see why this work is so important. So let me conclude where I began. We are living through a moment of profound change. We realize that some governments are working to prevent this change, but at the State Department, we are working to embrace it and the opportunity it presents for our countries and for civil society. And we look forward to working with you to support civil society as an integral element of democracy and an essential guardian of human rights. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and I think your grandfather would be very proud that you're testifying before this commission today. Mr. Steinberg.
Thank you, Mr. Congressman, Madam Congresswoman. I too welcome this hearing and salute you for shining a spotlight on this disturbing trend that you've described already of growing restrictions on the space for civil society institutions in a number of countries around the world, as well as physical threats against citizens who step forward to demand change. In 1990, I was serving as the foreign policy advisor to House Majority Leader Richard Gephardt, and I had the honor to travel with Mr. Gephardt, as well as Tom and Annette Lantos, to Budapest, Prague, Warsaw, and Berlin, literally within days of the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was a unique pleasure and a privilege to see the changes through the eyes of Tom and Annette Lantos, who were true regional heroes. In Prague, we sat down in a beer hall with Ivan Havel and other leaders of the Civic Forum. Tom Lantos' first question was, when did they plan to turn their movement into a political party and take over the government? Havel and his colleagues seemed baffled. Over the next hour, they explained to us that their goal wasn't to simply step into the shoes of the authoritarians. It was about diffusing power throughout society to lawyers, journalists, religious leaders, labor unions, business people, artists, ethnic groups, and yes, playwrights. It was all about creating space for citizens to run their own lives. I think about that trip frequently, and especially when I take a trip in my current role. I've had the opportunity over the last year to sit down with Afro-Colombians and indigenous people in Colombia, independent media and human rights lawyers in Georgia, displaced persons in South Sudan, disabled people and LGBT activists in Vietnam, and women and other activists, including youth, steps away from Tahrir Square in Egypt. It's interesting because all their comments mirror that Prague beer hall. These heroes are demanding a role in shaping their lives, their nations, and their futures. As you've pointed out, it's a disturbing paradox that at a time of exploding social media and open communications, many governments are seeking to place draconian restrictions on civil society. And my colleagues have already outlined some of the most disturbing situations, and they've addressed primarily the human rights and political aspects. So for my part, I wanted to focus on the developmental aspects. During 3 decades of work in this arena, I've learned a number of things. First, I've learned that development simply works better and is more sustainable when it draws on the full richness of civil society, involving people as planners, implementers, and beneficiaries. No government has a monopoly on good ideas, financial resources, ground truth, or moral authority. In too many of these countries, civil society are the eyes, the ears, and the conscience of their communities. In addition, civil society plays a vital watchdog role against governmental abuse, corruption, inefficiency, and they hold government officials accountable. Civil society also knows that development doesn't just mean 6 and 8 and 10% per capita growth rates. It means a sustainable improvement in socioeconomic conditions, growing educational opportunities, improved health, better jobs, and better housing. If we think about the Arab Spring, the experience there was a 6 to 8% growth rate for much of Mubarak's reign. But the lack of inclusion and the inequality led to bad distribution of income and wealth, arrogance, corruption, white elephant infrastructure projects, and a lack of opportunities for youths. At USAID, we're trying to address these concerns in 4 key ways. First, we're working to create and enforce international norms, working with our own civil society organizations, including many of the activists who are here today, Interaction, associations of contractors, human rights groups, women's groups, and so on. At the Busan Development Forum, for example, last year, the United States pressed hard and successfully for including strong language affirming the rights and importance of civil society. Specifically, the document stated, civil society organizations play a vital role in enabling people to claim their own rights, to shape development policies, and to oversee their implementation. Each signatory to that agreement agreed to enable civil society to exercise its roles as independent development actors. But it is, of course, telling that many of the governments that signed that Busan outcome document, and even those who led the drafting exercise, are the very countries that are imposing the strongest draconian measures now. Thus, we're also taking the steps to demand that governments include civil society in formulating all their development strategies and goals, in implementing these programs, and in monitoring their progress. This is especially true in our programs for rural development and food security under the President's Feed the Future initiative, our child survival efforts under the Global Health Initiative, our remediation and adaptation efforts under the Climate Change Initiative, and our humanitarian relief efforts. For example, I'm pleased to note that now every single project at USAID to be considered has to include a gender impact statement that states how that project will advance women's equality and gender rights. Third, we're working directly to create civil society institutions. A growing percentage of our assistance is going directly to reputable, transparent NGOs in developing countries. We're also helping build these organizations. In the Philippines, for example, we have set up an incubator for 120 NGOs in human rights, environmental issues, development, trying to create reliable financial, human resource, monitoring, and evaluation systems. The same is true of 315 civil society groups in Cambodia. Similarly, I was pleased to be able to announce at Afad University, that fabulous women's university in Khartoum last year, a new program to empower civil society women to participate in peace processes around the world, providing them training, stipends, and physical protection. Because we all know that the most dangerous profession for a woman is a peace builder. Finally, like my colleagues elsewhere in government, we advocate for these groups in meetings with host governments, by speaking out against abuses, by providing financial assistance, and yes, when appropriate, by wrapping the American flag as a protective shield around advocates who want us to do this. We all know that the simple act of meeting with a senior American official, or a member of Congress for that matter, can provide life-saving protection. Mr. Congressman, Madam Congressman, woman, it's hard. No higher purpose exists for the use of American power than to provide a stern reminder for those who would seek to shut down civil society that they are indeed on the wrong side of history. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank all of you for your testimony. I want to thank you for the work that you're doing. I appreciate the importance that human rights has in administration policies. And I have a few questions. And again, because I like everything you do, I'm going to begin with a kind of a critical question that something's kind of bothered me. And that was that I have to tell you, I was disappointed to learn last Friday that the administration is moving forward with a substantial arms deal for Bahrain, despite many continuing human rights abuses in that country, including excessive use of force by security personnel and the continued detention of peaceful opposition leaders and human rights defenders. And over the past few months, the human rights situation in Bahrain has appeared to get worse and not better. And the Bahraini people are only growing more disheartened as they see the continued repression and little government commitment to meaningful reform. And so, given this situation, I just don't think it's an appropriate time to provide Bahrain with arms. And I don't think we should provide Bahrain with any arms until there is a substantial and lasting improvement by the Bahraini government on human rights. I'm particularly concerned that when the United States provides arms to Bahrain or to any other government that violates basic freedoms, this weakens human rights defenders on the ground by sending a signal that the U.S. supports the repressive government. And so, I don't know whether or not, before that decision was made, that you consulted with human rights defenders in Bahrain, or not. And if you did, I'd be curious to hear what they had to say. But I understand the strategic importance of that country. But I think that the arms transfers such as these can weaken the position of human rights defenders in an authoritarian government. And so I say that because and everyone has a comment. I'm happy to listen, but it just I think the optics are wrong, and I think the message that it sends, not just in Bahrain but around the world, I think is wrong. So, but I thought I would express my frustration, and if you had any comment, you're more than welcome, Mr. Posner.
Sure. Thank you, Congressman McGovern. I think it's important to emphasize both what we did and how we characterized it. We were very clear last week that the decision to restore some security cooperation was done on the basis of our national security interests. We said forcefully and repeatedly that we did so mindful of the fact that there are a number of serious, unresolved human rights issues in Bahrain. We said it again clearly and repeatedly that we are very troubled by the growing polarization in Bahrain. There are both a daily occurrence now of violent protests where protesters are resorting to Molotov cocktails and other lethal force, which we condemn. But we've also been very critical of the government, as you've just said, for their excessive use of force, including widespread use of tear gas. We made clear that we are not supporting any items to the Ministry of Interior that could be used for crowd control, tear gas, and the like. We also said, and we will continue to say, that we are pushing the government for greater accountability for the abuses that occurred last year, torture and the like, which has been well documented by the Bassiouni-Bicchi Commission. We continue to address and raise concerns about hundreds of unaddressed cases where people are still being charged for peaceful protest, 20 doctors, the Al-Khawaja case in particular. And we continue to call for integration of the police. So the message, which I was part of several meetings with the government, including with the Crown Prince, the message from Secretary Clinton, from Vice President Biden and others, was clearly a message of our continuing concern and great concern that these human rights issues are not being addressed in a way that is going to lead to the kind of reconciliation and moving forward that we all hope for. And we will continue to press on these things. This is an important, a critical part of our agenda.
Well, again, for what it's worth, I mean, my experience has been that, and I appreciate the fact that you're sending some powerful verbal messages to the government that we're not happy with the progress that has been made up to this point. But my experience has been that back home, when we resume things like arms sales, that the optics are that things are okay with the United States. And just while we're on this kind of issue, I mean, similar to my concerns about Bahrain, I'm concerned that and I'm not alone in this, that we might be sending the wrong message to the Egyptian government if we continue to provide Egypt with high levels of military aid at a time when they're making it extremely difficult for NGOs to operate and are placing criminal charges on NGO workers. And military aid aside, how is the United States continuing to support civil society in Egypt, given the great restrictions that have been placed on civil society organizations in that country?
Again, this is an area where we have spent and will continue to spend a great deal of time and attention. We're at a critical juncture now. We're a week away from the first of the presidential, what will be the first round probably of presidential elections. There's an unresolved court case relating to the Constituent Assembly, which will draft the Constitution. There's also a challenge to the sitting of the Parliament. But we're clear going forward that the focus needs to be on Egyptian civil society, indigenous organizations, of which there are many, that are pushing for reform, for democracy, for human rights, journalists and bloggers. These are people that are right now highly anxious, and I talk to them all the time about their own well-being, about their own future. The United States will stand behind these people going forward. We're in a moment now where we wait to see what happens in the election, but the discussion now is where do we go this summer and the weeks and months ahead as a new government's formed? How do we make sure that the space for Egyptian civil society is great enough that these organizations can function freely without constraint? This would be a big challenge, but it's part of our agenda going forward.
Thank you. Mr. Steinberg, many countries are creating new legal barriers to civil society, such as restricting the freedom of assembly or association or instituting penalties for receiving foreign funds. Do you see a trend in the creation of such barriers, and if so, what accounts for this trend, and how can the United States support civil society in countries where governments greatly restrict NGOs or create barriers to NGOs receiving foreign funding?
The short answer is yes. We see an increasing level of restrictions you've raised a couple of them, barriers to receiving assistance from outside organizations. We've seen arrests. We've seen very restrictive laws regarding who can freely associate. It is, as I said in my testimony, a paradox, because it is exactly at the time when we're seeing this explosion of civil society, people coming together with different identities to express their identities as union leaders, as academics, as journalists, as women, as indigenous peoples. I think that in many cases they are viewed, and properly so, as a threat to the status quo, to privilege of government leaders, of an elite class, of an aristocratic or authoritarian leadership, both in the economic and the political realm. And so governments around the world have a natural tendency for self-preservation and respond. We, as a government, are strongly opposing those trends. As I said, we're trying to reaffirm international norms and standards through our work in the Open Government Partnership that the Secretary and the President have headlined, our work to support the community of democracies, to bring together governments that are doing better in this arena, to set standards, to essentially have a race to the top for good behavior in these areas. But equally important, we're working to support those very organizations on the ground themselves. And again, we have what I called in my testimony incubation centers, where organizations that are just getting off the ground are supported. And again, it all depends upon the kinds of support that they indicate that they want. Assistant Secretary Posner was extremely accurate when he said, we need to be guided by the people on the ground to tell us what kinds of assistance they need. When I was the American ambassador in Angola 15 years ago, whenever a human rights advocate would speak out, I would quietly call him or her, and I would say, do you want to come to the embassy and have a picture with me? And in some cases, they would say, absolutely, that would be the greatest thing in the world. It would help me. It would protect me. On a number of occasions, they said, what, are you crazy? You know, that's going to get me shot. And so we have to be guided by their judgment of what they need in these situations.
That must be a fight between Democrats and Republicans. Don't get, yeah.
Congressman McGovern, if I can just follow up on one last sentence that Don Steinberg just said. I think we are all mindful of the fact that there are a number of these restrictions coming into play even in the last year. And as he said, you know, governments see themselves as vulnerable because populations are dissatisfied with closed political systems, with corruption, with lack of economic opportunity and the like. But it's also very important that we recognize that each society has its own history, culture, experience. And so while we can talk broadly about the problem, it's also critically important, as he said, and we believe, that we both listen to people on the ground and recognize that what we need to do in one place may be different, even at a different moment, from what we do in another. These are, we're dealing with a range of countries where there is change underway and where governments are highly insecure, and the people on the ground who are leading the change agents, are in a very vulnerable position. We have to figure out what's best to protect them and support them.
I just have a couple of questions, and I'll yield to my colleagues. Mr. Tillman, how has the administration coordinated diplomatic pressure in response to legislative and regulatory threats to civil society? And have these efforts deterred governments from enacting constraining legislation and regulations?
It's an excellent question and an area where we've seen some very encouraging successes. We've been particularly engaged in a new working group that's been established under the auspices of the Community of Democracies with leadership from the Canadian government that brings together leading civil society organizations, including the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, and governments that share a commitment to defending civil society. Together, they've worked to identify draft legislation that poses a threat to civil society and then coordinate diplomatic action to either prevent passage of that legislation or ensure that it's amended to a point that it no longer poses a threat to civil society. There have been a number of very encouraging successes that have resulted from this mechanism. It is still, I think, too soon to say whether it provides a conclusive solution to what is clearly a very broad and corrosive challenge. But it's one of the tools that we feel provides a possible mechanism for addressing this challenge.
Thank you. Mr. Steinberg?
Just to follow up with one very practical example, we were all deeply concerned in the case of Uganda at very tough restrictions on the LGBT community and LGBT activists. That came to a head when David Kato, the very courageous LGBT leader, was killed a year and a half ago. The international community, I believe, led by the United States, put very strong pressure on the government of Uganda. And we made it clear through diplomatic initiatives directly with the president of Uganda, Mr. Museveni, that this would not stand. And after a period of time, the terrible restrictions that were being considered in Congress were put aside. They did go after the killer of David Kato. They did find him and convict him, and it was unclear that they were even going to try that. And perhaps most importantly, we've seen public statements now that have walked them back from that. And I want to stress one point that we were talking about earlier, which is to listen to the activists on the ground. Because one of the things that we were tempted to do was to cut off assistance in this environment. And we were told by activists on the ground, including Frank Mugisha, who is, again, one of the courageous leaders in that environment, please don't do that. Don't make us the cause of development assistance not coming to Uganda. That will only infuriate people against us. Use an affirmative agenda for that purpose. We did, and thank goodness it worked.
Just one final question, Mr. Posner. In his testimony submitted for this hearing, Brian Dooley of Human Rights First recommends a set of guidelines or standards for the United States to articulate publicly and follow consistently regarding its interaction with human rights defenders. I think such guidelines could be useful in helping human rights defenders in other countries understand what they can expect from U.S. embassies and officials in terms of engagement and support. How do you see the utility of articulating a set of guidelines for interaction between the U.S. government and human rights defenders? And what do you see as the lessons learned from the recent Chen Guangcheng episode in terms of how the U.S. interacts with human rights defenders?
Let me take the case first. As you know, we are actively help him fulfill his desire with his family to come to the United States. We've undertaken to fulfill our visa and immigration requirements, which we're ready to go. Our understanding is that he's now in conversation with the Chinese government. We are following this very closely. We're in constant touch with him, and we're going to do everything possible to bring him here. In the broader discussion about NGOs in China, there are a group of lawyers and other activists who found space shrinking for their advocacy. I was in Beijing about 3 weeks ago as part of a legal experts dialogue where we raised issues about the challenges faced by the legal community. We've agreed to have a human rights dialogue this summer. These are issues we raise on a regular basis. And I think people in the advocacy community appreciate the fact that we are as attentive to them. We're constantly meeting with them, and we're constantly raising these issues publicly. More broadly, I think the idea of guidelines is something we're very open to. We've been in conversation with Human Rights First and other organizations. Guidelines will take us only so far. I think there really is a constant need in a practical sense to engage with all of our embassies around the world to reinforce what the best embassies do. The best embassies have political officers that are in regular contact with NGOs that make it clear that it's a priority. We amplify their voices. We provide a lifeline when they get in trouble. We provide technical support and financial support. So I think we know how to do this, and it's a question really of making sure that across the board the best practices are followed, and that's very much what we're trying to do.
Thank you. Ms. Bonamici?
Thank you very much, Mr. McGovern, and thank you to all of you on the panel for the work that you do. I wanted to ask if you could give a progress report on the Global Human Rights Defenders Fund and the Embattled NGOs Assistance Fund. And I'm certainly not asking for you to reveal the identity of the recipients or beneficiaries, but in general, if you could tell us, Mr. Posner, about the type of individuals and groups that have received support and the countries in which the fund monies have been distributed, and what have they achieved so far? Thank you.
Well, thank you for that question, and it's something that we're very proud to have initiated. This really came out of the Lifeline, the Embattled NGO Fund, came out of the Krakow meeting, which Tamika was so centrally involved in, and where Secretary Clinton spoke so eloquently about these issues. We launched the fund in July of 2011. There are now 14 governments working with us. I think it's really important that we're not doing this alone. We've been meeting on an annual basis with those governments. We're trying to recruit more governments into the fold. And we've put in $3 million, but there's a total of $5 million. These are small grants. And we've begun to to deliver that money to organizations now in 26 countries, places like Zimbabwe, Syria, Bahrain, Uzbekistan, Ecuador, Russia. We've got a range of activities. Again, there's some constraint in going into the detail because a lot of these groups are eager to get our help but not eager to get a headline about it. But the idea is to provide emergency assistance, legal assistance, medical bills, etc., when they get in trouble, to help them advocate against restrictive laws when they're introduced and imposed, and to build stronger global networks so activists can learn from one another what they should be doing to protect themselves. The Human Rights Defender Fund has been around since 2007. We've provided about $2 million to over 800 human rights defenders. This is money that goes to individual activists who get in trouble. Again, it's labor activists, democracy activists, journalists, bloggers, and the like. And we've been particularly active since the Arab Spring or Awakening in a number of those countries. We've given money, for example, to 16 Syrian civil rights activists. But we are very engaged and very proud of these funds. It's money well spent. A little bit of money goes a long way. It both sends financial support but also shows the solidarity of the U.S. government.
Thank you very much.
You know, when I was getting ready for this hearing, I couldn't help but think about what John F. Kennedy said. He said, those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. And you all, I thank you for the work you're doing for those peaceful revolutionaries who are trying to make their countries better, because they're the hope for their nations. I want to say that, Mr. Steinberg, I appreciate your reflections about listening to the local voice. I think that well-intentioned support can sometimes lead to results that we don't want. And I don't offer my comments by way of criticism of our government, but I will say that I've been intrigued by the whole conflict in Egypt and have tried to ask a lot of questions. I haven't come to any firm answers yet, but I do know that we substantially increased our assistance. And according to some people in Egypt, we didn't consult much when we did it. And in some ways, that sort of ended up leading to the conflict, which resulted in several people being charged with the NGO law, violations of the NGO law. I was in Egypt back in November, and one particular Egyptian official was quite animated about this issue. But Egypt, in my view, was letting them exist there and not putting them out, but then not giving them a license to operate, but then gave them a license to operate for the election, but then after the election, charged them all. So, I mean, there's a lot of game playing and confusion going on. But I will say that I spoke with one American who stayed, because after the travel ban was lifted, we all left. But one American did stay, and that American made it clear to me that he felt he did nothing wrong, and that he wasn't there to criticize Egypt or America, but that he said he didn't do anything wrong, and that the people that he was working with were doing nothing more than help Egyptians find their way to the ballot box and to be effective at the polls. And he did indicate to me that he feels that as Americans we should, at least he felt as a matter of personal conscience, that he was going to stand and make his case, because he thought that if he didn't, Egyptians would be subject to perhaps even more fair on treatment after the light of international attention left, because the Americans left. And I don't really, I just offer that because I think it somehow is relevant to this conversation. And he said further that he thinks that, hey man, we don't have anything to apologize for, so what are we running for? So that's kind of what he said, and I thought that was interesting. Again, I just offer that as a reflection. What are we doing to try, when we give foreign assistance, particularly in the area of democracy promotion, have we institutionalized the suggestion that you made, Mr. Steinberg, to try to really seek out the local input?
Absolutely, we have at USAID, as well as with the State Department and other agencies. There's a firm commitment to try to work with and through local government, local civil society, local business as much as possible. We've established a goal at USAID of doing some 30% of our business directly with civil society or governments. In each of those cases, we are very careful to ensure that we're good stewards of the taxpayers' dollars. And so we do previous analysis of the financial systems. We insist on transparency. In a lot of cases, we insist that the project be completed and the results demonstrated before we put the money into effect. But in our development approach, we have learned a long time ago that country after country is not going to accept policies that are made in America any more than they're going to accept policies made in Brussels or London or Beijing. One of the phenomena we've seen has been what I call the democratization of development, which is a positive thing. There's almost a synergy that ties in here, because if you think about our development partners now, 20 years ago there were 3 of our development partners in Africa that were democracies. Today there are 20. And we can work with those institutions. They have transparency. They empower their local populations. That's the kind of development partner we want to work with. And if I can just say one thing on Egypt, and I don't want to go into too much detail. I think you've described it very accurately. The United States government thinks it's very important for there to be an active civil society in Egypt. The programs that you're talking about were part of $165 million to support democratic institutions, civil society groups that are reaching out to all elements of that society. It also went to support businesses, small businesses that are going to be creating jobs in that environment. And I would suggest to you that your interlocutor, the American, was exactly right. We've done nothing wrong.
Yes, sir.
If I can just follow up on that and take the Egypt example a bit broader. Some of the groups that we fund that are U.S.-based, like National Democratic Institute or the Republican Institute, Freedom House, are not there to pick winners and losers. They're there to build democratic muscles, capacities, to teach basic skills in societies where democratic institutions haven't functioned or haven't functioned well. So again, we're very proud of supporting them. They do this work in 70 or 80 countries around the world. They do it well. They do it professionally. They've done it for a long time, and they'll continue to do it. But the focus, I think, has to be on what goes on locally.
Right.
Because the name of the game is people are going to change their own societies. We can't change the societies for them. And there are local advocates now who are taking chances, but they know what their society believes and wants. And we ought to be, it's a question of money, but it's also a question of diplomatic and public support. We need to amplify their voices. We need to give them, as much as we can, the protection to be themselves, to be peaceful advocates. And as you said at the outset, the alternative is extremism and violence. And what I say to governments when I talk to them is, you have a choice. You can either allow a more open public debate with your own people, or you run the risk of extremism becoming the rule of the day.
Yeah, I think, though, that's excellent observation, Mr. Tim.
If I might, on the issue of
Element.
engaging with local partners, one of the goals behind the launch of our strategic dialogue with civil society was to get beyond what I call the STP problem, which is engaging with the same 10 people over and over and over again.
Another good point.
And we need to reach out not only within capitals to those who speak the languages and live in close proximity to our embassies, but also to those in more outlying areas of countries, and ensure that their voices are heard in our policymaking decisions.
You know, this is an excellent point as well. And if I may also add, I think that, you know, Americans, we need to take some risks too. I mean, I know that here's what, I mean, part of what it is what you're saying, Mr. Tillman, is get outside of our comfort zone. But I think we sometimes need to get out of our ideological comfort zone too. And there might be some. See, the thing is, when civil society flowers, you're going to have people who you're totally thumbs up with them. You love what they're doing, and there are other people who are also engaged in civil society, but they're peaceful. They believe in elections, but we may not agree with some of some of the things they stand for. I think America should run the risk of engaging civil society broadly, because at the end of the day, the marketplace of ideas in that country will win. But if we start saying, I mean, our line should be, when I was in Egypt, I actually gave a talk, and somebody said, should we have an Islamic country? I said, I'm not here to tell you what kind of country to have, by all means. But as long as you respect women and minorities, allow Egyptians to speak their mind, and I had one more. I can't think. I'm having a moment here. But as long as you observe basic norms of international human rights, you can call it what you will. You know, England has the Church of England, right? So I'm not here to tell you how to develop a religious reference for your country. And, you know, interestingly, I spoke to a full room full of people who were Salafi, people who were Al-Ikhwan, you know, the Brotherhood, the whole range of society. And I didn't get any significant pushback when I made that comment. Now, I don't know what the future holds for that country. That's unfolding now. But I do think that I agree with your point that, you know, if you want to learn how to run a fair election, we should be there to do that mechanical thing. I wonder if I might offer just one other question and get your views on this. Some of these countries, particularly in the Arab Spring, they don't have any civil society. Egypt had some. Libya maybe has none. Tunisia had some, but not much. What do we do in societies where we really are starting from ground zero? There is a certain amount of fear, trepidation, and even just downright lack of information about how to engage in civil society. I mean, how do we help people understand? Should we help people understand? But also, how do we help them understand the essential value of active civil society to a democratic society? Anybody care to offer views on that topic? There, yep.
I'll just offer a quick view. When I was appointed as ambassador to Angola in 1995, it was in the middle of 30 years of civil war, and the key victim of civil war is civil society. Organizations of women, organizations of lawyers, organizations of journalists break down because they're forced to decide, are you with the government, are you with the rebel movement? And so indeed, there was arguably no real civil society on the ground. And so one of the things we did was to bring in experts who had worked in similar situations in the past, who brought together very slowly groups to come together over specific issues in their community. So it didn't have to be women's organizations and women's rights. It could be, you know, we need a water hole in this community. And they would come together, and there would be a natural leader who would step forward in that environment. It was not always the educated person. And very quickly, that organization solidified. Then we would bring in experts, and we tried to do it as much as possible from other African countries. So it wasn't an American coming in, because Americans to civil society is very different. And they would sit down and say, okay, now you need some funding. Here's how you put together a funding proposal. Okay, you need transparency, because you know USAID won't fund you unless you have this transparency. They would be trained in that. Here's how you put together a human resource department, et cetera, et cetera. And frankly, it worked. And very soon, those organizations started to flourish. And that's what I'm talking about when I describe the incubation effort we're doing in the Philippines right now. A lot of that work is in Mindanao, where in fact they're emerging from a conflict situation where civil society ceased to exist. We're doing the same in Cambodia. I hope we're going to get to do the same in Burma when we get into that environment. So just there are ways to get involved. But again, I just wanted to finish my comment with going back to the previous issue, because I have a saying that's up on my bulletin board regarding the importance of drawing civil society and activists on the ground, and it is nothing about them without them. And I think that typifies the attitude that we need in these environments.
If I can just add one anecdote. I mentioned in my opening statement that my colleague Sonny Efron, who's here, was part of an effort, helped lead an effort to have 13 journalists and bloggers from 13 countries in Tunisia 2 weeks ago for World Press Freedom Day. It's interesting that a lot of the governments in the Middle East, North Africa, know each other well, but the activists know each other less well. They don't have opportunities. So we can be a convener to make those connections, both to share experience, to learn about how to protect one another. We found a huge appetite for just learning, how do you use the internet in a protective way? How do you use new technologies? How do you protect yourself when, as a journalist, you're in a demonstration? We sort of assume that everybody has a sense of this. These are people who've been in very isolated societies. So we don't necessarily have to have the answer, but by having the resources to bring people together, we can begin to build a network of activists who learn from each other, reinforce each other, and protect each other.
If I can add one quick point to that, several weeks ago, Secretary Clinton announced a new initiative called the LEND Network, which stands for Leaders Engaged in New Democracies. And this is a partnership that we've developed together with the government of Estonia, Google, the Club of Madrid, and a wide range of other partners, both in civil society and government, under the auspices of the Community of Democracies. And this initiative is going to bring together key leaders from countries that have had successful transitions to democracy with key leaders in countries that are in the midst of ongoing transitions to democracy, both in government and in civil society, and then create a secure virtual platform that will allow these leaders to interact on an ongoing basis as they have questions and have need for information, and it will allow them to exchange best practices and provide them with the tools they need to hopefully advance their work.
Very encouraging. Unfortunately, Mr. Chairman, they're dragging me to another meeting.
Good.
But I do want to thank all of the witnesses, and I'm going to try to make it back.
Good.
Thank you all very much for what you do.
Thank you, and let me just close just by kind of reiterating some of my concerns I made at the beginning. We talk about strengthening civil society. I oftentimes think we need to make a distinction between military assistance and development assistance, because oftentimes the military assistance is used to undo the very things that our development assistance is trying to help encourage. And that's why I'm very concerned about the Bahrain situation and the Egypt situation. The other thing I worry about, and and this has just been something that I've been concerned about for as long as I've been involved in any kind of human rights work, is that sometimes I think we play favorites depending on what government we're dealing with. One of the things that bothered me about the debate we had on the Colombia Free Trade Agreement is I thought not enough attention was given to the plight of the human rights defenders in Colombia or the situation facing labor unions. Colombia is an ally, as a friend. We want to continue that relationship, but sometimes friends have to be critics, and to urge them to. To understand that this is a problem. This is not just this administration. I go back to the previous administration. We've been told that things are getting better, that things are fine, and yet the numbers of human rights defenders that come under attack and who are threatened, who are killed, the plight of the trade unionists, and one of my biggest concerns about the trade agreement was that once it was done, the pressure is off. Same with Bahrain. I worry about once the assistant goes forward, then the pressure is off. And I understand all the other things that you're doing, and I appreciate it. So this is not meant as a direct criticism of anything anyone here is doing. It's just my general concern. I'm just venting as part of my therapy at the end of this panel. But it's just there are people who are hurting under governments that we have very friendly and cozy relationships with, and and I'm not advocating that we break those alliances, but sometimes we have a little bit of leverage, especially with military assistance, security assistance, and so I just leave you with that. I appreciate this administration's attention to this issue. I appreciate all the work that you're doing and its kind of newfound focus on helping strengthen civil society, and I think I speak for everybody on this commission when we say we want to be helpful, and to the extent that you have any recommendations for Congress along the way, please don't hesitate to give us a call. So thank you very much. Appreciate it. We're going to call our next panel, which will be Brian Dooley, Director of Human Rights Defenders Program at Human Rights First, Adote Akwe, a man